This is What on Earth is Going On, a show that was originally broadcast on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. Visit the website www.wogoshow.com. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Hello, my name is Ben Charland. This is What on Earth is Going On, your weekly podcast for a world in flux. Today we've got a great show. I've got a conversation with the Professor of Political Science from the University of Calgary, Anthony Sayers. We talk about the dispersion of power in government, the basic underlying social contract and how it might be eroding, the growth of the state since the Second World War, with globalization, technology, and how Canada is actually quite advantaged when it comes to our democracy and our government, if only because it's actually quite hard to herd us together. That's one of the strengths of federalism, even while we're always talking about the weaknesses. And of course, because we can't help ourselves, we talk about Donald Trump, how boundaries are being pushed, and how likely it is that he will be impeached before the end of his term. All of this is coming up in my interview with Professor Anthony Sayers. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you a favor. If you like this show, please spread the word about it. Put it out on social media, tell your friends, and if you can, give it a rating on iTunes or on Facebook. Also, please get in touch. Let me know what kind of guests you want to have on, what subjects you think should be tackled on this show. It's really important that we keep this conversation going. And with that, it's time for my conversation of the week. All right, I'm sitting here on a beautiful sunny day in Calgary, although that's only what it looks like outside the window. I'm here with Dr. Anthony Sayers. He is a professor of political science at the University of Calgary. Originally from Australia, Professor Sayers focuses on major political institutions, especially political parties, and how power works in a federal state such as Canada. He is also the author of the Canadian Elections Database, which contains all federal, provincial, and territorial general election results down to the district level since 1867. Professor Sayers, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Ben.
So my first question is really going to be about what you focus on in your work. But I want to we're going to talk about federalism, but I want to take it a level higher and talk about how power is distributed in government, how power is gained by government, how power is used in government, and then, of course, how it's distributed. Whether that's in federalism or within government itself, we're talking about checks and balances and all of this stuff. So with that in mind, I'm going to start with the obvious, usual question, which is, what on earth is going on?
Well, the notion of power is critical. Obviously, power and politics go together. So we know if we go back historically, that there's been many ways to organize power. You need to bring it into a central spot so it can make decisions and, in a sense, overcome the initial problem of all governance, which is anarchy. Right? You say, look, if the presumption is, if you're a true anarchist, that is a theoretical anarchist, of course you believe that we'd be self-organizing, but very few of us are true anarchists. Most of us worry that, without rules, we'll behave badly. So we need some set of rules. This is the classic Hobbesian view of the state, that you need rules, so you put somebody in charge, and they, you get laws about murder and good behavior, all the way down to good behavior. So that's fine, but then, of course, you create the problem that now you have somebody in charge and they can do bad things, and then you try to figure out how you can restrain those people that have power so that they act in good ways. Aristotle knew this, and he talks about it in his work, and Madison knew this in the American Constitution. Is one of the sort of premier examples of explicitly trying to understand how you give government power, then restrain it in a sensible way so that it doesn't hurt people. So what the hell is going on? What on earth is going on? Well, there's lots of fascinating things to talk about. For example, in America, you have a president who, not caring or apparently knowing much about government, is acting in ways that really press the limits of presidential power. And that pressing of the limits is really partly a reflection of the fact that Americans have allowed, including American legislators, have allowed the presidential office to become ever more powerful, far more powerful than the original designers expected over the last 50 to 60 years in particular. So he is, because he doesn't, I think, care about this stuff, just pressing all the limits he can. He's just walking as far as he can around the territory he thinks he can control. So what you have then is a president who is remaking the office by his very sort of excesses, and nobody knows quite how to stop him doing it. Nobody seems, not that people don't know how to stop him. It's not clear that anybody thinks it's a good idea to stop him.
Right.
And that, I think, speaks to, in the American case, this odd position that the president is in. When I was taught American politics, our professor said, the president is a sort of demigod. You expect the president to internalize things like what is good for the republic, what is the right way for a president to behave decently. And so, for example, the rules around emoluments and other things don't apply to the president. So the president can make money, personal profit, in office, but the presumption was that no president would, that presidents would be so bound by the office, by the notion of being the president, that and of the republic, and that they would not act in that way. Well, Mr. Trump doesn't appear to be bound by these sort of internalized moral norms of politics because he's not a politician and he doesn't seem to care.
Well, and surely conflicts such as these have arisen in the past in the American Republic and certainly in other democracies. And these democracies have found ways to adjust course and correct and fix the problem. Even in the United States, where Bill Clinton may have been impeached, he wasn't convicted, but there was an impeachment for behavior of this president. But it seems to be that, like you say, people don't think it should be done. Is this a question of power? Maybe a feeling that we don't have the power to do this, or is it a question of it wouldn't be right? It would set the wrong precedent. Why do you think that is?
I think some of what you said is true. History is contingent, and the particular arrangement of forces we have in America at the moment are not helpful for getting for controlling a president. We've particularly given that he was elected in a sort of wave of somewhat difficult to distinguish sort of emotions and social change. There's resistance to social change. People are upset. Other people who want even faster social change, certainly in some ways, and then economic uncertainty. So he gets elected on this sort of, stew of uncertainty and stuff, and nobody's quite certain, because they have to be re-elected, how to play that. They're not sure. If I oppose Mr. Trump, am I opposing the sort of wave that elected him, and will I be washed out with that wave at the next midterm elections or whatever? For example, Paul Ryan, who I think has been a robust politician up to Mr. Trump, seemed to just decide that he could not take on. I don't know if he felt that, maybe felt more at one with Mr. Trump than I thought he might. So he didn't seem to take him on. So there's a real sense in which the contingent effects, the circumstances in which we are now and in which Americans find themselves, I think, really mitigate against anybody going after a president, because everybody's very focused on electoral success. That's increasingly true. Americans, members of Congress, get re-elected at about 85%, so they're highly risk-averse. Nearly none of their colleagues have lost an election, relatively speaking. So there's a whole environment of being very focused on trying to avoid mistakes and being re-elected. So upsetting the apple cart is not native now to American politics, and I think the way it might have been at times of the past. So that's an electoral problem. And the other one is, as I said, the sort of balance in the institutions between the president and the Congress, and even the Supreme Court arguably has altered to make the president sort of insulate the president.
Right.
And Twitter and other technological change has could have increased the envelope for the president. So the president now can get to people before Congress gets to speak or anybody else gets to comment.
Or even the newspaper gets to speak.
Exactly. Yeah. So everybody's now responding not just to Trump, but to their perception of his supporters and that whole communication apparatus. And I think that makes everybody a bit uncertain as to how to behave, what they can do, and what the costs of going up against him are. It's very hard to know. There's
so much in what you just said that I want to talk about. First of all, back to this idea. I mean, we're talking about impeachment. If we want to talk about stopping a president and taking him out of office, there's only two ways to do it. It's Article 25, not Article 25, the 25th Amendment.
Correct.
And then impeachment, which the founders of the American Republic believed was the one and only way that a president should be able to be removed from office, which is why if the Mueller investigation decides they want to indict him, that's actually questionable if they even can. And the Justice Department for a long time has said, no, you cannot indict a president. You have to impeach him and then indict him. But the bar that the founders set for impeachment is so high. And what I wanted to say was that Democrats are reluctant to go forward with impeachment because if they fail, and it's a very good chance that they would, they need 67 votes in the Senate. And if they fail, they're essentially giving him carte blanche, because to try a second time would be almost ridiculous. The second thing I wanted to bring up was something you mentioned with Hobbes, there's the Leviathan of the state. And we were talking before we actually started the recording about Edward Luce's book, The Retreat of Western Liberalism. And one thing that he says in the book is that we may be moving or morphing from the John Locke's social contract to Hobbes's Leviathan. Can you briefly unpack those two ideas and maybe just give a comment on if you think that might be happening?
Yeah, well, the social contract view of liberalism, which, has, like all theories, its own weaknesses, is this idea of, it involves voluntary participation, right? So contract implies that two parties agree and that they enter an agreement somewhat voluntarily. And Locke was a sort of, perhaps the archetypal view of that. And so what that does, of course, it fits with liberalism, that, both the ruled and the rulers have a choice and they choose to join together in this way. Of course, Hobbes had a slightly blunter view, which was, you put up with the Leviathan. Wasn't really a contract. It can be structured as a contract, but it's clearly more weighted towards the ruler. That the ruler, I'm willing to put up with the ruler because safety is important to me and certainty and things like that, right? So that's on the sort of the sort of two different ways of thinking about it. As we imbue, so let me go back to the notion of uncertainty. One of the things that Hobbes really talks about is life is nasty, brutish and short. And that's a sort of one way of thinking about that phrase is it captures the uncertainty of life. That, if you have to defend everything you own, or if there's no time for leisure and learning, then society can, you can't really have a civilization. Right? So uncertainty is right at the core of both our personal responses to a difficult universe and our collective responses to trying to find a sort of way of living together that helps us all feel better, gives us all perhaps leisure time for learning, time for reflection, time to enjoy ourselves. And my take on these things is that we've been through, since the Second World War in particular, but starting really before that, the growth in the state, the growth in the welfare state, increased taxation. We take for granted the state will cover off a whole bunch of things that used to be worries for people, right? So the state will look after you mostly. If you have a major health problem, will educate you, will provide you with all sorts of services and protections right? So all that has really grown dramatically. In 1910, the Canadian state, that's both federal and provincial, accounted for about 10% of gross domestic product. At its height, it accounted for nearly 40%. And in other countries, it's more than 50%. So the state has grown enormously, and we've imbued it with, or allowed it to have these powers in a sort of social contract understanding.
Right.
Now, going back a step, as the world has grown larger and globalization has, or both in population and more interconnected, globalization initially, which was seen as a net win, has also brought with it a range of negatives. Less certainty about the future. Jobs have moved around. The job that I had, we see this maybe in Trump's America, the jobs that a dad had may not be there for the children, or the mother had. So there's that uncertainty. Look at the movement of people. The assault on national boundaries is sort of physical evidence of the growing unpredictability of the planet and of the world we live in. And now the environment. On top of that, what are we doing? And are we going down a road from which we can't return? So all those things have increased the level of uncertainty. And I think the broad way of thinking about that is, as uncertainty goes up, we look for other sources of certainty. We look for, I think, psychological resonance. We look for ways of searching out truisms, things that we can rely on in an increasingly unpredictable, unreliable world. So politicians, if you think about, I think of Mr. Trump, but even Mr. Trudeau in a different way. If you think about, Mr. Trump offered "Make America Great Again," and in a sense, so did Mr. Trudeau, except that the underlying message was Canada is a lovely, nice place.
Yeah.
Whereas the underlying message from Mr. Trump was America is going to be a tough hombre to sort of negotiate with, and it's going to run the world the way it should.
Yeah.
So the underlying message, but in a sense, what Trudeau argued was, I'm going to take you back to a kinder, gentler sort of Canada, pre-Harper or whatever. We're going to do more peacekeeping. We're going to have more refugees come in. We're going to sort of, Canada's back. So in some ways, they were both calling on these images of their countries that displace uncertainty amongst voters, right? In the American case, it's the idea that you're strong America. We can do as we want in the world. relax. We will find you a job. We will make you great.
And we'll defeat our enemies.
That's right. And, of course, therefore you have to create a lot of enemies, which Trump has gone around. I mean, it's actually amazing. He has – that script requires him to find enemies, and that's what he does brilliantly. Whether we buy them, Canada as an enemy seems odd, but if you don't care about or know much about Canada and you get a tweet from Mr. Trump saying Canada is doing us in on trade and blah, blah, you might well believe that that's Canada in this case is the enemy.
Well, what's amazing about what Donald Trump has done in his presidency of picking enemies, it doesn't seem like he cares who he picks. He's not thinking through the normal political rubric of picking enemies, which is you pick someone who gives you value. So you pick someone who's not on your side. So a scapegoat, for example. So if you want to go after free trade with Canada, great, as long as you have enough voters who don't benefit from free trade. But what we're learning is that Republicans who support Donald Trump and who suffer from tariffs, for example, still support Donald Trump because they're willing to put up with, I guess, his behavior because of the certainty that he provides in other ways. And I think you're really hitting the mark when you talk about certainty, because when a voter goes to the ballot box, especially when they're under threat, under siege, maybe it would be different if things were going well and we just need to keep things going well. But if we feel like we're under siege, then we want someone like Justin Trudeau in the gentler version of Canada, or Donald Trump in the nastier version of America, to fix this and to give us a more certain future. And that's actually, I mean, it's dangerous, but I suppose it's actually quite appealing if you think about it that way.
It's appealing, I think, to voters. It's dangerous in the sense that I think we started this conversation as that allows politicians to move back towards a more Hobbesian view of the state. Right, where they can say, look, I will deliver certainty, but you have to give me power to do that. And that's the justification, that you say, look, unfortunately, times are hard. There are more, for want of a better word, you could say criminals, whatever, that, in the original construction of Hobbes, it's this notion of social threat, right? And you need to empower me. And so since 9/11, for example, an unconnected event, our attempt to try and assert safety led us to, give away rights. And that's been now documented. All the Western countries essentially gave away rights, their citizens' rights, in trying to find ways to, control terror, maybe, if you believe it. I'm not quite sure I ever quite brought the full story about how much threat there was, but we did that. And now in a different way, we're saying, okay, be powerful, do stuff to protect us. So take some more power. So again, leaning towards a more Hobbesian view of the state, which is fascinating. I do think that there are some real dangers in that view, that we're not good at watching politicians, and we know there's an information mismatch. Politicians know stuff we don't know, so we're hardly ever able to really control what they do and understand why they do it. But it, to the degree it brings certainty to voters, that may be something that people are looking for.
Well, and there's many scholars like Steven Pinker, for example, who argue that things are actually getting better. And the feeling that we are under siege, whether it's immigration or economic uncertainty or cultural insecurity, that the feeling that this is all bad and terrible is actually overplayed. But the reason that it would be overplayed is perhaps technology. So the social media of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, spinning out the story to the point that I really do believe that everything is going to, well, quote, hell in a handbasket, and there's nothing I can do about it but try to find some strong man to go into power. What do you make of that? Do you think that technology has actually accelerated this process, or is this just we go through these ups and downs of democratic politics anyways?
I think the ups and downs is exactly the right way of thinking of this. However, those ups and downs have different amplitudes, and I think without any doubt that social media has enlarged those amplitudes in all sorts of ways. The directness, the number of people you sort of can touch electronically, in a sense, and it's nearly overwhelming. I mean, you get on any of your feeds, and you very quickly, why are people having a better time than me? Why are people doing? Oh my God, this person's so much smarter, or whatever. It's very easily psychologically to be overwhelmed, or now to know what's going on the coast of Italy in a direct, and people are tweeting this stuff. Look, somebody's in the water. You can actually, it's overwhelming. So in that sense, I think there is some. there is some sort of technological effect, or a communication effect. I guess McLuhan and others, right, would talk about the fact that as the medium has changed, it's actually shaped the message in a whole new way.
The medium is the message.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely, I think, true. The other part of that is that politicians are politicians. They look for margins, and politicians everywhere over the world can see now that this uncertainty in the past has been used to justify many things, and usually many awful things, from war to pestilence. So war basically. So politicians are always looking for the margins. So think about this. You see people worried about things, and you think, look, I can wind that up a bit. That separates me out from my opponents. Not only that, because it's sort of inchoate, I can give it meaning. This is not like an argument between left and right and, up and down, so much as trust me, right? I will fix this. So that's the most dangerous time of all. We should never trust in that way any politician, in the sense of, trust me, don't worry about it. You don't need to watch me. You don't need to know anything. Just let me do it. But politicians there's two advantages to structuring that uncertainty. One is that you can wind it up emotionally, so you can get people to vote emotionally. And the most recent work on election studies shows that if you can get people to pick their side first, it nearly doesn't matter what the side believes.
Right.
So that's why emotions are so important here. You can get them to say, look, I am your saviour. I will fix this. So trust me, and then I'll go off and make some policies. But they're all, because you can trust me, the policies are going to be good. That's the sort of logic here. So you get that, that it drives people, it gets them emotionally engaged, and it's sort of empty in some ways. Mr. Trump is a business person who's against trade. Really? That's an odd arrangement. You wouldn't expect that, and he's a sort of mishmatch of things, and I think he just picks them out of the hat random. There's a hat, and he says, well, I've got a bunch of things in. I can be anti-immigration today, and I'll be anti-trade tomorrow. But, he may well sign a trade agreement sometime and say, well, this one works for us.
Because I negotiated.
Yeah, I negotiate, and it works for America. So that just trust me on that. So it's not like he's committed to anything other than being, I think, stirring the pot and putting so much velocity into politics that nobody can sort of catch their breath.
Constantly forcing himself to be the front of every headline.
Yeah.
And he does indeed suck the oxygen out of every room, like he's doing in this conversation.
Sorry.
No. It's me too. It's almost impossible not to talk about it, because it is the answer to the question, what on earth is going on? Right. Donald Trump may not be the cause, but he's certainly the symptom of what is going on.
That's well said.
And it's impossible not to recognize that. When we talk about I guess the movement of democracy in regards to social media, we're also talking about morality. And you just said something very interesting, which is that when people pick their side, it doesn't really matter what happens after that. They've chosen, they're in. And it's almost a tribal sensibility. And I don't know if you've read the book The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt.
No, I haven't.
He's a moral he's a moral psychologist, and he talks about how human beings are moral creatures. But morality is in part genetic. It's also in part learned behavior, and that we are not purely individual species. We're 10% or 15% beehive. That's how we operate. So therefore, we have to have a tribe, and we have to pick our tribe. And morality is not so much the question of yes or no on any issue. It's where do I fit in my tribe? And if my tribe believes that this is right or wrong, or even redefines what right or wrong is, which seems to be happening. If you look at the Republicans in the United States, or even conservatives in Canada, the things that they believe are drastically shifting. The same people believing completely different things. So only 20 years ago, Republicans believed in immigration. They completely believed in free trade and NAFTA, and the TPP would have been a Republican dream 20 years ago. Today, it's the reverse. The same people on the Democratic side are defending free trade, and the same people are now opposing. And there's many people who are holdouts from that. But this complete reversal is bizarre, because if you don't agree on these things, then what is the core of being, say, a conservative in Canada or Britain or the United States? What does that actually mean? And I think for many people it just means Donald Trump or Justin Trudeau or Stephen Harper or whomever.
That's right. It's in whom we place our trust. That's sort of what it comes to mean. If you let's sort of widen down and think about the populist movement. One that populism was around forever. As soon as certainly in electoral democracies, if you look at the first part of the 20th century, as the franchise expanded, there were populist movements of forms everywhere, and sometimes they were quite successful. Even in the Canadian case, the progressives affected the politics in a number of provinces, and eventually the Progressive Conservative Party took its name partly from them. So, and they reshaped politics in America, the progressive movement in the 1920s. So, populism is not new, but what it is a little inchoate, as I said before about Mr. Trump. You can shape it. It gives you, and it's an emotional claim. It's something like, we're oppressed. The classic sort of populist claim is, we're oppressed by forces bigger than us, outside our control. So we have to stick together, and we have to come up with our distinctive way of remaking the universe in our image. Right? That's sort of the these deep elements of populism. So there's rejection of otherness often because it's a club, and you need a clear boundary around that club. So your heightened sensitivity to otherness, a sort of sense that the forces of history and the universe are beyond your control and are pressing you unnecessarily, unfairly. So around the world, you see this return, in a sense, to I think an earlier period in some ways, where populists, the sort of uncertainties that we associate with the pre-large state period, no unemployment benefits, no social welfare, where people's life, they were open, more open to being to the claim two things: we're oppressed by these forces, our lives are not good enough. If we can vote, we can get hold of the state and bend these forces to our will and help ourselves. Less uncertainty, better lives. And in some ways, you can see, in this world where if you play up uncertainty, there's this need to create a in-club. Well, that's the anti-immigrant, anti-otherness. Right. There's a need to talk about what's special about us. Well, there's too many of us to really have a easy. So you think, America is great, or Canada is this, or whatever. You have these myths, or Brexit. Right. That it's the European Union that did this, that made all our problems. So if we get rid of the European Union, we get rid of the problems. Right. It's not true, but for enough people in Britain, they could be brought into under that umbrella. That I have more in common with you. Okay, you do something totally different than I do, but we're both Brits, and it's the Europeans that are the problem. So that sort of myth holds us together enough that we can reject Europe and get rid of the problem. Right. So this this emotional claim, I think your very point about our need to have our groupthink, our beehive sort of view of morality or need for morality plays into that. And it's what I think politicians everywhere are sensing. Some are smart and sort of worked it out, and I think others are just, like Ralph Klein, I think, was in Alberta, for example, just intuit, what the hive thinks. Ralph Klein was famous for saying, you find the crowd and you go and stand, you walk in front of it. Wherever the way they're going, you go. And that was his intuition about Albertans, that if you just listen closely enough to the Martha and Henrys, as he called them, you would sort of go, oh, okay, this is what bothers them. Well, I can fix that. I don't care. Why? Well, I'm untethered. Ralph Klein, despite his image at times, was relatively untethered from sort of ideology. One of the interesting things, although he cut the state a lot, it was easy for him, partly because he never really thought it through very much. He just said, let's do it. Why? Well, people seem to want it, and I can convince them that it's the right thing to do. Right. We can blame other people. It's the equalisation.
It'll be popular. Quite simpler. That's quite simply, it'll be popular.
And Alberta has a long history of sort of populist-style leaders that have said, look, we don't want to be left and right. We want to be Albertan. Right. As if Albertan and left and right are on some sort of scale, which we know they're not, but which, again, I don't want to be left or right. It's not blue and red states. It's American. It's not conservative and liberal. It's Canadian. Politicians like to sell us these centralising myths, because it gives them more room to move, and it allows them to get to us emotionally.
Well, and you've said before that part of the reason, if you want to understand why Albertans vote Conservative, it's not necessarily because they're conservative, it's because they're not Ottawa, and they want to show that they're not Eastern Canada, they're not the federal government. So for them, for so long, to vote Conservative is the best way to say that.
Yeah, we're not the Liberals of Ottawa.
That's right.
And we have so much money that it doesn't really matter, for better or for worse. It's a good example of the freedom that comes with way too much money in some ways. Albertans could pretend to be conservative in the sense that they would vote Conservative. May even said, "Look, I'm a fiscal Conservative," while spending more money than any other province per capita,
Right.
and complain about equalisation, even though we're still doing better than anywhere. Like, all the myths that sustained it were pretty hollow at times, and yet there they were.
Right.
They could be dragged out in an election in the right order. Say, it's the Ottawa's the problem, or we're paying too much, or Quebec, we're giving too much money to Quebec, or I don't know, there's something peculiar. Being an Albertan makes you a genius just by your very essence. All these claims are clearly at close, with close attention, are nonsense, but they create an emotional appeal.
Well, what's interesting about what you've said too is that for a populist or someone who's whether they're changing the way people think or they're just going with the way that people already think, there's clearly the in-group, and then there are the out-groups, and there's always an elite, whether the elite is the one oppressing them, or they're the ones enabling the oppressors, or they're the ones too weak to stand up to the oppressors. So, many people on the right in the United States say that the Democrats are too weak to stand up to immigration and the big corporations that benefit from it. So we need someone like Donald Trump to come in and be strong and defeat not only the elitists but also the immigrants who have been taking advantage of us. That's the narrative that's being told. But what is critical to that populist way of thinking is that there is a general will that is interpretable, and that there is a legitimacy to act upon it. And what I've heard it phrased recently is that it's not really dissimilar from a monarchy. So in a democracy, ostensibly we say that there is a general will that is sacred, that must be followed and cannot be overruled, and that it takes, a good democracy follows that through. And if there is something wrong, then the people are not corrupted, their leaders are. In a monarchy, never was the monarch overthrown. Their advisors must be bad. It's the advisors we have to get rid of so that the sacred, pure monarch in the middle can be the one who shines above and rescues us. And in a way, this faith in our system is the same faith with a monarchy as it is with a democracy. And that, I guess, is maybe both troubling but also necessary. That's
an interesting parallelism. I like that idea that we have to imbue some part of the institutional order with the core sort of ethic, with the ontology perhaps of our society. So it's the monarch. The monarch is selected by God usually, or and so that special status gives them the right to tell us what to do, and we trust them. And when they say go off to war, we follow them. And now we've done that to the people. And that's a very interesting idea, that we have imbued the people. But the people, of course, have, just like monarchs, their own pathologies. Sure. We know from electoral studies, and in fact, a lot of people don't really know a lot about the vote that they are about to cast, and don't really know a lot about the issues, and that they are persuaded by, a good-looking leader, or a particular event that's just happened, or proximate causes. They pick a side and then they follow. So you're right that although it's maybe admirable because it has embedded in it some of this sort of democratic impulse that we should ask the people. In fact, we know from Arrow's work and others' work that in fact there is no such thing as the people in a technical sense, that you can't add up people's preferences collectively. So that has to be managed. And in fact, I would argue that modern politics is about managing the inchoateness of sort of the collective will into some sort of form that can be governed. Right. So that's all that great difference has to be basically forced into a 50% plus one vote in the legislature. And you have parties and all these institutions that gently, we hope, and thoughtfully narrow all that great diversity and preferences into something that we can use. But that, I think, holds the problem that, in fact, there being no sort of coherent set of preferences for that thing called the people, it's open to being manipulated. It's open to being shaped in ways that politicians prefer. And it's also, like all institutions, when I said pathologies, it makes mistakes. As you pointed out earlier, we may be over-egging the threat of, that the world imposes. Like Hungary, Poland, Germany, Italy. They, how do we gauge the threat, if that's the way to think about it, of people moving around the planet or the environment or our economy? It's hard to know. So those things now, if those sort of that group mentality can easily get that wrong. If enough people blame a few apparent causes, for their problems, then you have really the decision is made in a sense by the popular will, and it's not always clear that it relates well to real information or common sense.
I think this is a great segue actually to federalism in Canada, and the reason why is I think that it's more complicated it's more complicated in the United States. They also have a federal system, or in Germany, or many countries, Australia in the world, that have a federal system where the aggregation of preferences and desires is broken down not just in one legislature, but in Canada into 11, or if you include the territories, 14. And then if you include the municipalities, which have devolved powers from the provinces, you've got countless.
That's right.
Locuses of power that are exercising this power on behalf of their people. In a city, say like Calgary, where we are now, city council, 14 people plus the mayor, can aggregate the preferences of this one place. But they don't have to think about what people think about in Halifax or Winnipeg. They can focus here, which will be different than obviously a much larger national focus. That's a pretty simplistic way to put it to someone who's an expert in federalism. But how does federalism deal with these problems? And I guess the corollary to that is it working?
I'm reasonably happy with the way Canada works. I mean, if I can point to lots of individual decisions where I wish that, for beer, I'd like beer to be easily brought anywhere across the country and moved, because I like beer. But, there are individual cases where the sort of logic of federalism drives you crazy. But in fact, if you look at any country, unitary state, federal, the pathologies are everywhere in this regard. So I'm not too worried about that at times at a general level. I think there are two things. You point out one of them. But when you have cities that are reasonably powerful and provinces, and there is a notion that you're only having to capture a certain amount of the political preferences out there. That makes it more malleable, more open to, I think, being ordered and sensibly followed. So that's a very important thing that, as you say, it makes it more practical, more doable. But the other thing, too, is it puts all these sources of power against each other, and not in the explicit way, perhaps, that the American system does, although the federal part of Canada does, but in a way that makes every person in power think, well, I'm going to have to convince at least one other person of this, the mayor, or the mayor of the premier, or the premier of the prime minister. And I think that's the core of this of quite a Lockean notion, in a sense, that power becomes inherently limited. Not limited in the sense that if you line up the right players, you can do a lot. And I think that Canada is evidence that plenty of times in Canadian history, we've been able to line up the players in a way that has, to rewrite the Constitution, difficulties. Most probably the hardest job any political community does. We managed to get there. You can line up the players to do the right thing.
Or fight wars, for example.
Or to respond to crises around the world. We are good at that. We can do it. Why? Well, because these things play to areas where we have lots of agreement, right? Often. And where they don't, like in the Constitution, the cost of not getting agreement is so great that there's a lot of impetus to get it right. So that division, I think, is a great strength of Canada, because it forces Canadian politicians, to constantly negotiate and constantly converse. And if you compare that to the American system, which formally is meant to divides power, the bully pulpit that the prime president is using now is sort of overwhelming that. It's harder to do in Canada, it turns out, even though the Canadian Constitution was considered and is a centralising sort of document. And in the 1950s, people who studied federalism classified Canada as a centralised federation, if you can believe that, as a quasi-federal state. So, but they were a bit late, but because the process after the JC, across the last century and a bit, has really been the extraction of power from the federal government, not unlike the extraction of power from the monarch in Britain, actually, and it's diffused out to the provinces and also to the municipal level. Although in Ontario, the municipal level predates Canada, in particular in central Canada and eastern Canada. So actually, municipal level of government was quite powerful already. But still, the point being that power has been dispersed in, I think, fascinating ways, and Canadians have made it up. So if you look at the Constitution, you have a set of rules that sort of centralises. That's not going to work, partly because of Quebec and a big country. And politicians said, well, I know that's a rule, but we have to make it work. So come on, let's sit down and figure this out. And so the genius of Canada, many people have pointed this out in different ways, is that it is arguably a country constructed by politicians against the flow of history, against its own institutional order, to work. And it works. It's a really unlikely place. And that was why people like me love it. Political scientists love Canada because it evidences all this fantastic capacity of a civil society to reshape core political institutions to work pretty well. And if we stretch it a bit further, at some point Canada's going to have to confront the notion of treaty federalism or how we formalise our relationship to Indigenous Canadians. And if any country in the world has managed to say, look, I know there are the rules, but let's sit down and within the context of those rules, write a sort of pragmatic set of guidelines and even rules that can disperse power in a useful way that everybody gets a bit of it and people feel engaged and valued. You know, there are things like that really at the sort of frontier for Canada. There are real opportunities, I think, for Canadians to use the things you pointed out, this sort of strange federal dispersal to their advantage.
I think that what's fascinating about this is that if you were to put, the Canadian federal system onto a pedestal and raise it on high and use it as an example, you could say that it is the perfect mix of American pragmatism and British incrementalism. You could say that those two forces have created a state that works in spite of all of the difficulties, in spite of being a bicultural and then multicultural country, in spite of being a country which requires us to have, in a way, split loyalties. I'm an Albertan, but I'm also a Canadian. At some points, I'm more of an Albertan than I am a Canadian, but then the reverse may also be true, say, in a war. No one went over to Europe to fight for Alberta. They fought for Canada, or they at the time may have fought for Queen and country too. This split loyalty seems to make it work in an odd sort of informal way, but it could also be a threat to it. I mean, I'm not just thinking about the classic threat of Quebec to Canadian federalism, but the sense of, especially in a time of increasing polarity, that having split loyalties in a country, and maybe loyalty is the wrong word, but split identities may cause more and more fracturing with time.
I mentioned politics is all about events and contingencies, so you can never quite predict how things are going to come together. People who you think will never win do win, and people who think should win don't, and it's hard to know quite how the circumstances got there. But I think of divided loyalty as a net win for Canada, and in this way, the capacity to take that community and shape it in negative ways. I mean, both positive and negative. I guess you win and lose a bit on this, right? You can say, Canadians are never going to sort of be a cohesive group or it's harder to get Canadians to be a cohesive group to go and do stuff. Is that bad? I don't know. You think about the upside of that is that, we're not so amenable to being captured by a political leader and persuaded that, we're all one and we just ignore left and right, or we ignore ideas, or ignore reality. We can all just go off into the sunset, we can have it. So in a sense, that divided loyalty makes us natural skeptics, critics of political power, like this. Or you say, well, I voted for this government, but, my local government is a bit different and I can see that why they disagree, and I now have sort of shared loyalties on some issue, or I'm cross-pressured. And that cross-pressuring makes it hard to capture Canadians, I think. And that's a great thing. Makes us think about politics in interesting and different ways, that we're not so easily herded together. And I think that's our sort of one of our great advantages. It makes us hard to sort of manipulate, or harder to manipulate. Not impossible. I think, for example, even though we may like things that the Trudeau government does, they are very good at shaping this story that we're all Canadians working together for a common purpose. They've been very, their communication strategy has been excellent, and they've really managed to sort of have the right issues come up at the right time and manage that so that it's this constant reminder that the Liberal Party is sort of Canada's party, and Canada is on track again to be what we thought it should be, So,
right.
But even with that, Albertans and Manitobans and Nova Scotians have disagreed with the federal government. So we see that sort of natural opposition doesn't destroy the country. Nobody gets too upset. We work it out by sitting down together and talking it through.
Yeah.
Well, I rather like it.
You mentioned this word story, which I return to on the show time and time again. Justin Trudeau told a great story in 2015, which is in a way make Canada great again, but it was more about let's return to the roots of what Canada is, at least in terms of the great liberal Pearson-Trudeau vision of Canada. And Donald Trump is telling a story that we may disagree with, but he is telling a narrative that gets people on his side. And I just wanted to go to the book that you wrote in 1999, which I just pulled out my book to get the title right, Parties, Candidates, and Constituency Campaigns in Canadian Elections. And the reason I bring that up is because one of the chief arguments you make in that book, if I'm correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the local dynamics of an election campaign are critical for understanding and often overlooked when we're trying to understand politics in a country like Canada. That we have to understand what's happening on the ground in a constituency election in order to get the bigger picture. So then my question is, how do we balance that with the overarching narrative that someone like Justin Trudeau or Donald Trump is telling in a campaign? Do they intermingle a little bit, or are we missing one by valuing the other?
We certainly miss things if we focus on anything, but the story is the right word. For most people, telling an election campaign story wants to be told a very high level of abstraction. There's there's two or three horses in the race. They're going around the track. Okay, there's some people who feed them and candles or something. But in the end, it's a sort of a big story, and that's not wrong so much as only very partial. And if you actually want to know how that horse gets across the line, there's a lot of other stuff behind there that needs to go on. You need to get good candidates. You need to run competent local campaigns, raise money, not just at the big level, at the local level. You need to have signs up to convince people that you're legitimate. There are lots of evidence that, if you have no signs in a constituency, people will wonder whether you're a serious candidate.
Right. Very
simple line, right? So all these things mix together, and the point being that your focus gives you some insight and prevents you having others. So if you're focused on the local level, that's not going to tell you the outcome of an election. What it will tell you is the contribution that, these 338 bits all fell together in a particular way to get us to a national election outcome, a single a governing party. So yes, if you're focusing on them individually won't help you, but you can, if you say, okay, let me explain the local and look at the dynamics of the local and how is it that those have changed. Some of them are secular changes that affect, say, the whole country, the whole region, but the local ones are, somebody reinterprets the party platform in a useful way, or they're a good candidate because people know them and therefore they raise lots of money.
Right.
But even then, it's easy to presume that there's this wave that goes across the country, but rather like sort of sound, or rather like light, photons and waves, you need the individual moments to actually respond to that wave effect. It's very similar. That if the Liberal Party couldn't have attracted good candidates in 2015, it couldn't have really won an election. So, are candidates more important than the maybe selection of Justin Trudeau? No. But you need both of them for this sort of light to travel through political space.
Right.
Right? So you have to have the arrival of Mr. Trudeau changed the appeal of the party for potential candidates.
Right.
But you need those potential candidates to sign on and give away part of their life. And if you know anything about politics, it's a very heavy ask on people. You lose most of your life when you join politics. So it's a heavy ask, and unless there's a chance that they'll win, you won't do it. Certainly in your riding, but even if you're thinking about, say, potential cabinet members, you won't be the message will not be appealing unless the party looks like it's got a chance to win. So the selection of Mr. Trudeau and then the gathering of people who are competent, the raising of more money than they had in the past, after the change in the rules, and then the selection of great candidates, many good candidates who might not have run if one of the previous leaders had still been leader. So you can't really disaggregate in a true sense these things. You can do it analytically. I'm just going to look at these bits: the leadership, the local campaign, the overall result. But they clearly work together.
Right.
And the first past the post system, sort of that light metaphor is exactly right. That it expresses itself in local campaigns. If we had a different electoral system, these effects would be quite different. But we have that. You need a candidate. If they look like an idiot, they sound like an idiot, they are an idiot, can I vote for them? Well, maybe because I really want to change in government, I'm still willing to vote for them.
Right.
But it at least creates that question and that tension between the local and the national and your preferred ideology and your preferred candidate.
Right.
And that those tensions create the dynamic that is the wonderfulness of Canadian politics.
Well, here's something that's interesting with federalism. In Europe, you have a country like Germany, which almost always has a coalition government in power. And they are formed by different parties coming together, but often the same parties coming together every single time. So for Angela Merkel, the party in Bavaria, and then the rest, and then there's another party in the rest of the country. They don't compete with one another in their areas, but they always form government, but they still remain distinct parties. In a relatively small country in terms of geography like Germany, where most people, it's relatively homogeneous as a country, although that's changing with time. But it's also compact. It's within Europe. And yet they have all of these different parties representing all of these different preferences. Granted, it's a different electoral system, but then you contrast that with Canada, which may be only 35 million people, but a massive country from east to west, north to south. And that only has really usually two parties, at most three, competing in an election, none of whom, except for, say, the Bloc Québécois, are reduced to a single region. Even if one can be strong in a region. I mean, the Liberals might be strong in Atlantic Canada now, but that wasn't always the case. So why is it that a country the size of Canada with such diverse preferences has this system? Is it purely because of the electoral system? Or is it something else going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's not purely. It's good. When only Canadians, well, maybe Australians as well, say things like Germany. Well, it's not that big a country. Of course, if you're a European, it looks enormous. But right, you're right. That you're right. I mean, it doesn't have a geographic stress in it in quite the same way that, say, Canada or even Australia or the US have. But the electoral system is critical to explaining the things that you mentioned. But it's also true that the electoral system has generated a raft of smaller parties that keep sort of throwing themselves at the system. Sometimes with the progressives and others, they actually make an impact, right? And they change the system. But Canada always overproduces parties electorally, even though it's got relatively stable legislative parties. There's only two parties have ever held government federally, actively, right? So there's an interesting disconnect between politics on the ground, which tends to be quite tumultuous, and the sort of stability in the legislature. So, for example, Canada, about sad to say for MPs perhaps, but half of them can expect to lose their seat in any election. That's pretty much the highest in the world, right? So in other words, 1 in 2 MPs across time, it's not always true, it may be a bit less this coming election, for example, can expect to lose their seat. That's extraordinary. That means that although the ship of state looks like it's a liberal ship of state is sailing through history fairly stably, underneath that is all this churning as people come and go. And that's yet to be fully understood and explained.
It's like a human body that every 7 years most of its cells are
disappear. Exactly.
Yeah.
So you have this fascinating sort of sets of things. We produce more parties electorally than nearly any other. India, we can talk about other places, but it's unusual the number of parties compared to America or even Britain, Australia. Many more parties in the lower house than you'd expect contesting, and that's true at the provincial level. And that brings us back to federalism. That sure, at the federal level you get this, but you've got options. You can vote locally for a different party. And if you look at the provinces, there are many parties that only run in the provinces, rather like the CSU in Germany, Bavaria. So the Saskatchewan party, or now the UCP in Alberta, will most probably be stuck in their own regions forever and never turn into. So Canada produces a combination of the electoral system and sort of diverse politics, gets expressed in a particular way because of those rules. But in fact, the rules also, and that's first past the post, make it give the largest party a huge benefit. I do want to take you back to Germany for a minute and point out that one of the problems for the Germans, which is going to be true for I think other European countries in the short to mid-term, is that they've had a unity government of the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, Social Union, CDU, Christian Democratic Union. So that means that if you're a centrist voter in Germany, you had really had no choice for the last 2 or 3 elections.
Right. And
some of this German First Party sort of effluxion may be from people saying, look, I'm tired of I'm going to get the same government if I vote for either the big left or the big right-wing party. I'm going to get the same government. So there's no real choice here. We've lost choice. So even PR with this is MMP, right, with its proportional element. Every system has its sort of difficulties, and in this case, it's when you get governments of national unity, there's a pressure on people even at the centre to vote for the edges. And that we may be seeing some of that in European countries now. So, what we thought of as generally a centralising, coalition building, gentle sort of electoral system in PR, under the right conditions behaves in quite different ways. So, it's a tough time to be a centrist voter in Germany if you like basically what you're seeing, but you'd like, some minor changes. Not unlike you get in most two-party systems, even in Canada. I know people like to talk about Mr. Harper being, this and Mr. True that. But in fact, if you look at most things that have happened with the new government, probably well in excess of 95% of it is basically carrying on what previous governments, not just the Harper government, but the Liberal government before him, have done. There's a huge amount. So it's the edges that you change. You want to have the census back, and you want to change a bunch of laws about how we treat difference and things. That maybe I shouldn't call those edge issues, but much of the business of government carries on. But you get choice. You can say, I want to push it in that direction. Well, in Germany you can't. And I think that there's a certain amount of political resentment and sort of resentment building up in the system it's not easy to know how it's going to be released. So
for my last question, we've only got a couple minutes left. When we've talked a lot about the distribution and the expression of power in politics. And we're also asking this question, of course, what on earth is going on? What do you think we're not talking about enough when we ask the question about power, but also what on earth is going on? What do you think we're missing in the conversation that we need to address in order to understand?
That's a good question. There are many things that I go through my head at any one time that I think it's a pity we don't take more account of that. And so I feel like if I pick any one of them, I'm going to be bending the conversation a particular way. I do think that when we think about the modern world, we're encouraged and when diversity is a good thing. It's difficult to know how governments deal with diversity in sort of comprehensive ways. Just like you mentioned earlier, I'm an Albertan and then I'm a Canadian and then I might be a Stampeders fan or whatever, right? That in fact our identities are malleable and open and they change. And so in our, I think, honourable desire to figure out, look, how do we deal with oppression or how do we deal with people that have been excluded, we need to create a group. We say, look, there's a group, but we have to have a definition of a group. Why? Because these people have been excluded for some common shared characteristic or experience or whatever lifestyle choice. That's fine because I think that's what you have to do, but it's not a sort of profound solution because, in fact, members of that, we have what we call broadly the ecological fallacy. Amongst that group of people with all sorts of different experiences, they may have shared in some oppression or they may have barely experienced it, whatever, but they also may think of themselves tomorrow quite differently. So governments, there's no essential component. When we create groups in society, whatever group, which we do and we must do for policy application, we should be thoughtful of saying, well, yeah, okay, it's necessary to create a group, but there are all sorts of diversities within that group that we should be aware of and cautious about before we presume that group believes or thinks or has this experience. And so when we apply policy, I think it needs to be aware of the fact that that diversity happens on dimensions we've yet to really even think about. And with any group that you want to try and help even or hinder perhaps, there will be differences in that amongst those groups and policy needs. So, if I say to you, if somebody said to me, well, what's your identity? Well, it depends which day you ask me.
Right.
So resting, in a sense, I think resting too much politics on identity in some ways, feeds into that notion of uncertainty that we worry about. If everything is mobile, if my identity is all that counts, then what identity do I want? Well, if I'm not one of the identified groups, there's a sort of an encouragement to find a way. I'm open to the argument that, okay, I will join the America Great Club, or I will join the whatever club, and we're going to fight the good fight against the X's and the Y's, or whatever we are, right? So I think standing back and realizing that there is the things that connect us are at least as important as the things that divide us. And to get that balance right and say, look, it's great to be a Canadian, but it's good also to be an Albertan. And it's okay to say, look, as an Albertan, I tend to think this way, and as an Canadian, I think that way, and this has to be sorted out in politics. And these aren't essentialist things, being an Albertan and a Canadian, or anything. Being a Calgarian or Edmonton, this is not an essential.
They're constructs.
They're constructs. And so those constructs have power, and it's not always to the good. And they can be manipulated and used by people. And if you say to people, well, a Group X is getting too much advantage, join my group and we will fix that. You can see the manipulation or the means for manipulation that are opened by particularly populist politicians, and why the otherness and inness and outness are so critical to the way that they construct their messages.
Professor Sayers, thank you so much for coming on the show.
A real pleasure. Great questions. Thanks, man.
That's the show, and now it's time for your quote of the week. It's from the 5th century BC Greek leader Pericles. Just because you do not take an interest in politics does not mean that politics won't take an interest in you. As always, thanks for listening.